I want to welcome everyone. Welcome to Rocky Watch. I'm Joanne Blay. I'm the Program Officer for Public Events at the Rockefeller Center. We're here to discuss New Hampshire elections with UNH's Professor Andrew Smith. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You can always ask questions at any time during this event by using either the chat or the Q&A function. And now let me introduce Ben Vogley. Ben, you want to turn on your camera for a second? Hello. Ben is one of our student assistants at Rocky, and he will be facilitating the question and answer portion of our event. Professor Smith will be sharing some slides. It's hard to digest data without the slides. And for the best viewing experience, if you go to the top of your screen, you click on View Options and select Side by Side. And then there's a slider bar. You can drag that to change the size of the slide. And appropriate for today's event, we're going to run a quick poll, a quick demographic poll. Let me get that started. Just a 3-question poll. If you want to take a minute and tell us who you are. And we'll share those. We'll share those results. Okay, about 3/4 of you have voted. We'll just give you another second. All right. That's 80%. That sounds pretty good. We'll end this. And let me share the results with you. So we have a lot of community members in the audience. That's great. And it makes me happy to see that a lot of you are still reading the Valley News. And look at that, 74% of you are New Hampshire voters. Okay, that's great. Thank you for helping us with that. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Jennifer Jarrett. She's a government professor here at Dartmouth College. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Joanne. It's really hard to imagine an election where there's been more discussion of polls or the interpretation of polling data. So it's really my absolute delight to introduce Professor Andrew Smith, who's the director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center and professor of practice in the University of New Hampshire's Department of Political Science. Professor Smith has published in leading political science journals, and he's the co-author of the book, The First Primary, New Hampshire's Outsized Role in Presidential Nominations. Professor Smith has an extensive experience in survey research, and he's held leadership positions in organizations devoted to survey methodology. This is vital in an industry that's undergone significant changes in terms of how survey researchers contact respondents. UNH's Survey Center conducts polling for several prominent media organizations, including the Boston Globe, CNN, USA Today, Fox News, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, just to name a few. At the Survey Center, Professor Smith also oversees the Granite State Poll, which is a cohort of approximately 3,400 New Hampshire residents who have been randomly selected to participate in statewide research in an online format. And this poll has played a major role in helping us understand the opinions of residents in this politically important state. Tonight, Professor Smith will be sharing his insights on New Hampshire politics based on several polls that he's recently conducted at the Survey Center. The title of his talk is 2020 New Hampshire Elections, Potential Sea Change in New Hampshire Politics. Looking forward to the talk.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm going to share my screen now and do what we're all getting used to be doing, having done now that we're in the age of Zoom. I'm going to be showing you a PowerPoint from this view right here. So hopefully everybody can see that. So again, thank you very much for having me here this evening. I love to talk about polls. I love to talk about politics. And I would like to first start off by putting this election into a broader historical context and a national context, because I think what we're seeing in the United States is an increase of partisanship and partisan voting and straight ticket voting. That's going to have a big impact on what happens in New Hampshire. So to begin with, I think we've seen a structural change in the United States politics over the last several decades. This is mainly seen in the polarization of political parties. We now have two ideological homogenous parties, largely a right-wing conservative party and a left-wing Democratic party. And they seem to be going even further. Furthermore, the electorate is somewhat evenly balanced, meaning that both parties seem to be able to win in each election, which means now we get divided government, both at the state level, in federal style, but even within states, and also at the national level as well. This all leads to no holds barred political conflict, the kind of stuff that we don't really like to see as voters, but both parties engage in it because they see that they can win every election. So every election is critically important, more so than it used to be. So here's, I think, a nice chart from the Pew Center for People and Press that illustrates that growing polarization within the political parties. These are slides that ask about 10 questions that come up with an ideological scale for voters, from strong, consistently conservative to consistently liberal. Back in 1994, you can see the median Democrat and the median Republican are pretty close to each other, not much different. 2004 even, not a lot of difference here between median Republicans and median Democrats. Now by 2017, which is the last year they conducted this, we have the median Republican and the median Democrat far apart from each other ideologically. We do not have those conservative Democrats anymore. We don't have liberal Republicans anymore. This also means that the parties now have less interest in fighting over the middle voters, the independents in the center, and more interest in mobilizing their bases. And that means that the fresh meat that gets thrown out to both the Republicans and the Democratic bases to get out and vote and be angry about politics have definitely been thrown, causing us all to feel more angst about politics. We can talk about how the media gets engaged with that as well. And the other thing is there's only now a very few competitive congressional districts due primarily to gerrymandering across the country. And there's only a few competitive states. Seem to be more this year, but still there's really only half a dozen to a dozen of those competitive battleground states that we talk about, and New Hampshire is one of them. This chart shows the divided government that this polarization has led to. If you look, this is just the 1900s. You can see that for the most part, we've seen one party control of most of the national branches of government. This started to break down somewhat in the 1970s, but since the 1980s, you can see there's only been periodic times where one party has controlled both the House, Senate, and the presidency. And we are in one of those periods of divided government now. And again, that makes things more angsty, I guess, when we look at politics. This year is a somewhat of a replay of 2016, certainly a little bit different. Times always change. But most importantly, we don't really have two popular candidates. Elections are typically a referendum on the incumbent. Trump now is the incumbent. It's going to be harder for him to kind of sneak through because people are voting whether to support or oppose what he's done in office. But many voters would rather vote against him than vote for him. They know Trump and they don't like him. Biden's somewhat more popular than Clinton was in 2016, but their campaign is largely focused on voting against Donald Trump, not so much offering an alternative vision for the country other than we're not Donald Trump, because Biden doesn't have a lot of strength of support, as I think the New Hampshire primary this year showed, where he finished 5th. Hard to predict where voters are going to go or stay home. We know the bases are going to stay the same, but it's going to be whether or not people show up for the election that's going to be the key, because we have these unpopular candidates. So here's, to start off, just looking at the direction of the country. This is an old measure that the pollsters use. It's not a very accurate measure. It's kind of an unbalanced question, but we know how it operates. Typically, it operates when you have more than half of the electorate saying the country's headed in the wrong direction. That's not very good. And you can see that we got a lot of people still believing the country's headed in the wrong track. It's improved a little bit since COVID first kicked in, but we're still not very happy about the way things are going. Trump, you can see, is consistently unpopular. He's underwater. This is the 0 point. This is the net favorability rating. So it takes the percent who have a favorable opinion and subtracts out the percent who have an unfavorable opinion. If you're at 0, that means you have equal favorable and unfavorables. Biden's a little bit above 0. He's about 7 or 8% above. Trump is down at -12. Quite a bit of a difference there, but those are not levels of popularity that people typically want to see. Trump's job approval rating is also quite low. He never got the honeymoon period that most candidates get when they come into office. He's been underwater throughout. Now, political scientists like to pay attention to 46%. That's his little dashed line across the middle here. If you're above 46%, you get reelected. If you're an incumbent, you get reelected. If you're below 46%, you don't get reelected. And Trump right now is below 46%. So by that kind of a measure, it's not looking good for Donald Trump. One of the major issues that has changed how we as political scientists predict what's going to happen in elections is COVID. Prior to the COVID virus hitting and the shutting down of large parts of the economy, I think Donald Trump had a really strong chance of being reelected. This has been really thrown up in the air because of COVID and the downward spiral of the economy, but also because the perceptions of his handling of COVID are not good nationally, and they're really not good in New Hampshire as well. So let's just turn to that national horse race. It's at about a +9% Biden lead, and it's been fairly consistent throughout the last 2 years, the last full year anyway. Biden is liked more than Trump, but I think that the race is likely to narrow nationally and in the battleground states as we get closer. We can talk about the problems with trying to find those shy Trump voters that some people are talking to. But this kind of picture really bodes well for for Democrats in New Hampshire, because we've seen such an increase in straight ticket voting in recent years that if you come out and vote for Biden, you're likely to vote for Democrats all the way down the ticket, with the one exception of governor. So the battleground states, it's narrower, but you still see that Biden has almost a 4 percentage point lead. These are from yesterday, so it's about as up to date as you're going to get. Again, I expect that to narrow as well. This is what the Real Clear Politics Electoral College map looks like right now. A lot of undecided and a lot of just leaning states. The big difference this year is we see some states that nobody would have ever considered as states that are up in the air. Arizona, Texas, and Georgia in particular are states that aren't usually on anybody's list of battleground states. They are in play this year. That means that Trump is having to spend money to defend states that he wouldn't normally have to do. The only Democratic state that's come on here since 2016 in that up in the air look is Minnesota. Minnesota could be closer this year than we've seen in a long time, and no Republican has won that. I think you've got to go back until the second, no, not even Reagan on his reelection. Walter Mondale even won that. So let's talk about the national outlook. The short answer is Biden's in a good position to win the presidency. He's got higher polling numbers. He's got more money. Those coattails are likely to increase that straight ticket voting for House and Senate races. Dems could take the Senate. The Republicans lose those seats in Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina. The only seat Democrats are likely to lose is Alabama, which is kind of a fluke for them. And Democrats, I think, are likely to retain the House. Well, let's go on to New Hampshire. So New Hampshire, why do we bother talking about New Hampshire other than to us who are voters here? It's nice to see 3/4 of us here are New Hampshire voters. But it's only got 4 electoral votes. It doesn't normally make any difference in elections. Talk about why it does or when it does, but it's been a battleground state since 1992. It really has been close since 1992. Everybody fears 2000, and this is why New Hampshire's 4 electoral votes matter. Bush defeated Al Gore here by 7,200 votes in 2000. Ralph Nader got over 22,000 votes, and I don't think too many of those Nader votes were votes that were really secret Bush voters. If Gore had won New Hampshire in 2000, he would have been president. And I think that's the thing that everybody fears, how close it can be. 2016, this was again a very close state. Hillary Clinton only beat Trump by 2,700 votes here. Could be that close again this year. Let's talk about the background of the election here in New Hampshire. First of all, the economy's been improving. It really got slammed with COVID, but it's been improving since that time. It has been trending Democratic for decades, but it's still pretty close. Trump remains unpopular here, and Shaheen and Sununu, the 2 other big name candidates here, they're quite popular in the state. So I'm going to go through some of that to show you some information. Again, I got a lot of slides. I'm going through them quickly. They're going to be available for you if you want to look at these more carefully, but just to give you a sense of the numbers behind some of these things. So first off, perceptions of the New Hampshire economy. This is where they were prior to COVID hitting. Those sorts of numbers would have likely spelled a Trump victory. They plummeted down here. This is the percentage of people who said they expect good times in the next year, but you can see they've increased over the last several months. And the percentage of people who said they're going to be bad times really never spiked like we saw happening during the recession of 2007, 2008. So the economy's decent and getting better. But the perceptions of this are terribly partisan. And this is something that I think is a problematic thing for political scientists and political theorists going on. Among Republicans, 63% that think that New Hampshire's economy is going to be really good for the next year. But among Democrats, that's only 5%. That's a 58 percentage point difference. That's huge. Everybody's experiencing the same economy, but their political lenses are causing them to interpret that quite differently. New Hampshire is seen as headed in the right direction. We have 54% saying that it's headed in the right direction, only 24% headed off on the wrong track. This has declined a bit over recent months, and I think it's declined because Democrats largely remember that there's an election, and you can see here that the percentage of Democrats who said things were headed in the right direction has plummeted from nearly 60% just about a year ago. Now it's down to 27%, whereas Republicans and independents stayed about the same. So Democrats are really kind of leaning into this. I don't want to say they're hoping for a bad economy, but their perceptions are that the economy is going to be bad. I mentioned about New Hampshire, where it's been historically. It's been trending Democratic since 1980. It's been about a 23 percentage point increase on the linear model for this. 2016 was a little bit of a dip, but Democrats still had 50% of the two-party vote in that election. As I mentioned, showed you earlier, Trump was unpopular nationwide. He's even more unpopular here. He never got a bounce. This is his favorability ratings. He's only at 42% favorable, 55% unfavorable. Biden's somewhat less unpopular. He's at 47% favorable, 45% unfavorable. And these numbers that I'm reporting at the end, these are just from last week's Granite State poll. So these are the newest numbers that are out. So he's a little bit better, but still unpopular. Trump's job approval rating, not good. In May, he was still above 50%. But if you look at how people were going to vote before the COVID really hit, 46% of voters in the state said they would vote for Trump. That's down to 43% now. People have decided to go behind Biden, 44%. He's been now at 55%. So his lead over Trump since COVID really kicked in and the economy kind of hit has been fairly stable over the last several months, certainly since June. This is something that, again, bodes well for Biden because things haven't moved around. I should say as a caveat, as a pollster, this isn't that much different than things looked in 2016. And as it turned out, that race was quite close. And we can talk about, again, the shy Trump voter a little bit later. But I do want to turn to some of the other races, since I want to quickly cover the entire New Hampshire landscape. Jean Shaheen's in pretty good shape. She's been leading her Republican rival, Corky Messner, by a pretty consistent margin, about 15 percentage points. Just heard on the radio before this started that Messner has had some problems within his campaign. Several top people have just recently resigned. That's never a good spot to be in right before the election. Shaheen has stayed fairly popular. She's been running for statewide office with a couple exceptions really since 1996. And she's well known to people in the state, and her popularity has stayed pretty stable throughout that period. She's at 45% favorable, 36% unfavorable, about where she's been in other elections, a little bit better than she was in 2014 when she ran against Scott Brown. That was a big Republican year. This is not likely to be that big of a Republican year. Corky Messner, still unknown, and those people who know him don't like him. He's at 38% unfavorable, 24% favorable. So adding those things in together, Shaheen being the incumbent, being popular, running in a general election year where Democrats typically do well, and running against a relatively unknown and unpopular candidate, she's in pretty good shape to win, I think, re-election this year. For the governor's race, gotta look at Sununu. He's in a good spot as well. He has high job approval ratings. His overall job approval rating is 73% approved right now. That's enormously high. 98% among Republicans, 90% among independents, but it's still 43% among Democrats. And it was a little bit higher than that earlier in the year. So he's seen as doing a good job, particularly in how he's handled the COVID-19 issue here. 95% of Republicans think approve of that. Even 70% of Democrats approve of his handling of COVID-19. So it's going to be very difficult for Dan Feltus to really kind of cut into this, as most Democrats even think that Sununu has done a good job on this issue. By the way, this is something that is pretty interesting. It's a similar pattern to what happened with John Lynch. He dealt with the crisis of some floods early on in his career as governor, and his popularity stayed high ever since that. Governors are able, because they're chief executives, to distance themselves from the top of the ticket, even if the top of the ticket is unpopular, like Trump is in New Hampshire. Sununu is able to distance himself from Trump simply because he's perceived as doing a good job handling his job as governor. Sununu is still popular, 54% favorable, only 17% unfavorable, and Dan Feltus is still largely unknown, and those people who do know him really don't like him. So he's at 22% favorable, 33% unfavorable. Still relatively unknown for a candidate this late in the political campaign. And here's the horse race numbers. Our most recent poll had Sununu at 62%, Feltus at 37%. That's a wide margin. It's going to be difficult for him for Dan Feltus to overcome that. I would imagine it'll end up being closer than this, as people tend to vote their party as they get into the voting booth, but it's still a fairly wide margin. So moving on to the congressional seats, Chris Pappas, he's in pretty good shape. He's running against Matt Mowers, an unknown person who's this is his first race. Pappas is likely to win. He's got a 53-43 lead in our most recent poll. In the second CD over your way, Annie Kuster, she always seems to underperform a bit in polls, but comes through. She's got a rematch of her race with Steve Negron back from 2018. That was a big Democratic year that's likely to be closer this year than it was in 2018. Negron is 4 points behind her right now. In 2018, Kuster defeated him by 13 percentage points. I think Kuster will definitely be helped by that straight ticket voting coming down from the presidential race. One of the things we think about, it's important to remember when we get down to these lower level races, is how few people actually pay that much attention to politics. Outside of the people on this call, I think that you'd be surprised. Research has shown over and over that only about 40% of Americans can tell you who their congressperson is. That's their congressperson. When you get into the state elections, people can't really tell you who anybody is. So let's first go to those state elections. The New Hampshire Executive Council, fascinating body, sits and votes on many important issues with the governor, appointments, contracts, monies that the state is going to spend. Right now, Democrats have a 3-2 advantage in the council. It's going to be really close. It's 46-45 right now in the two-party race. This could go either way. So I'm not going to make any predictions about how the executive council races, but I think it could go probably 3-2 Democrats, 3-2 Republicans. Turning to the state Senate. The state Senate and the state House are something that I think are hugely important. And this is where the sea change, the potential sea change in New Hampshire politics really kicks in. There's an important adage in politics is that you want to win elections, you want to win majorities in your legislatures in years that end with 0, because that's the year that the census comes out and you draw the districts for the next 10 years. The Republicans in 2010 did an excellent job drawing districts favorable for them. In 2000, they did a similar job and not as good as 2010. Right now, it takes about 53 to 54% of the popular vote for Democrats to win majorities in the New Hampshire State House and the state Senate. Right now, we're seeing that Democrats have about a 6 percentage point margin in this. It's a little bit less, but when we run this through some algorithms that we've been using for years and years, this still comes out to a 12-12 tie. So even though Democrats have about a 6 percentage point advantage in the generic polling, are you going to vote for the Democratic or the Republican candidate from your district? That only translates to 12 seats out of the 24 seats. Similar thing in the state House. Republicans have or Democrats have about a 41 to 38% advantage. But when you run that through what's happened in the past, that turns out to be a 207 to 193 seat Republican majority. So there's if this tightens up, or if you get some of that straight ticket voting, that could close up and Democrats might be able to win, but it's going to be very challenging for them to be able to win this as well. If Democrats win control of the House and the Senate, that means they will write the legislation for the district lines for the next 10 years. Now, the governor can veto that legislation, but they're going to have to go in to have some sort of a negotiations then between the governor and the legislature. But I can guarantee if that happens, the districts will not be drawn in a way that is as favorable for Republicans as the current districts are. Should that happen, Republicans could be shut out of most seats in New Hampshire politics for the next 10 years, with the exception of, say, of governor. So I've talked several times about the shy Trump voter and what the shy Trump voter means. And we've been, as pollsters, very concerned about this in the wake of the 2016 election, where there was some pretty decent research that showed that Trump supporters were just unwilling to talk with pollsters. They wouldn't answer the phone, or if they did answer the phone, they would maybe say they're undecided or they were going to vote for the Libertarian or something. But when they got to the polls, and they did go to the polls, they voted for the Republican candidate Trump. So what we tried to do is to look at that, look at it through the lens of sociological theory and public opinion. There's a theory in political science and public opinion called the spiral of silence by a woman named Elizabeth Noella Neumann, a German public opinion researcher. And she found, studying German elections, that if you perceived that your candidate was less popular, not necessarily going to win or lose, but was just less popular in the eyes of the media or the eyes of the people that you interacted with, You would be less likely to talk about that candidate at a cocktail party. You'd be less likely to put a bumper sticker out or wear a button on your clothes or put a sign in your yard. And you would be less likely to talk with a pollster. So what we did in this most recent Granite State poll is asked a series of questions that touched on this. So we asked Trump voters and Biden voters the same series of questions. If you were a Trump voter, we asked, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? I won't put a yard sign for Trump in my, I won't put a sign for Trump in my yard because I'm afraid my house might get vandalized. And we would ask Biden voters the same thing. I won't put a Biden sign in my yard because I'm afraid my house will get vandalized. Now look at the differences here in the perceptions of who is the more socially desirable candidate, who is the more popular candidate. 68% of Trump voters say they won't put a sign in their yard because they fear their house will be vandalized. Only 38% of Democrats said that. It's about half. 65% of Trump voters said they won't put a bumper sticker on their car because they're afraid it would be vandalized. Only 31% of Biden voters had that same fear. 45% of Trump voters say they won't talk about politics and their support for Trump to friends and coworkers, compared to 24% for Biden supporters. And 42% of Trump voters say they won't even talk about their support for Trump to friends and family members, where only 19% of Biden voters will say that. So that tells me this is pretty compelling evidence of that spiral of silence. I can't ask the follow-up, are you less likely to talk to a pollster? Because these are people that already talked to pollsters in this election. We did ask one other question that touches on this to try to get a sense of the magnitude of that Trump, that shy Trump vote, and if it's out there. We asked people, despite who you're going to vote for, regardless of who you're going to vote for, which candidate do most people you know support? So overall, 34% of voters say most people support Trump. 32% say most people support Biden. 26% say it's about equal. 9% say they don't know. The thing about this to remember is this is the same poll that shows Biden with a 12 percentage point lead. So that, again, is an indication that there are hidden voters out there. I just don't know what the magnitude of that is. So I, like you, am waiting to see what happens in this election. But this is something that we're definitely paying attention to. I'm on a panel that's reviewing the 2020 elections for APOR, the American Association of Public Opinion Research. This is definitely one of the things that we're paying a great deal of attention to. So my conclusions, and I say these are not predictions. One prediction I will have is that it will end. We'll get over this election. I don't think we'll get over the partisanship, though. I think it will likely increase after this election. And I think whoever wins in 2022, the opposing party will win the House and the Senate. We've seen these sorts of back and forth in the midterm elections pretty consistently now for the last 15 years or so. And I think that that's likely to happen again. I think the presidential election will be closer than the polls are now showing. I think that's going to tighten up. We're already hearing about some pollsters who are doing some work trying to identify who that Trump voter is and gauge the magnitude of that. That's hard to do. And I'm a little hesitant about trying to figure that out just yet. In New Hampshire, I think it's mostly status quo, but the thing I'm really paying attention to here is what happens in the state house and the state senate, because if Democrats do manage to take majorities in that, then I think we're going to see some major changes in New Hampshire politics. So that's everything that I wanted to talk with you about. And now I really want to give you the opportunity to ask me questions. I know a lot of you have questions about this election or want to state some opinions about the election. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions that I can.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Smith. That was a really fascinating presentation. I just wanted to start off with a question touching upon the topic you just mentioned, this idea of shy voters. public opinion researchers think of this kind of behavior as mainly being driven by impression management concerns. So you're aware of some sort of social consensus or social norms, and you're answering questions with that in mind. And so I had two related questions. I was wondering if you had some insights into who among Republicans are shy, and then has the shy voter changed? And so this is something that people were talking about, scholars were talking about in 2016. And so with respect to the first question, I would imagine that maybe high education or high income Republicans would be the most likely to be shy. There's any number of sort of other psychological dispositions that might also incline people to be shy, but I imagine you're not asking those kinds of questions. So I was just wondering about demographics.
Mhm.
And then I would think that the person who's most likely to be shy now would be different than 2016, because in 2016, there was Trump's personal behavior was drawing a lot of attention and making some people uncomfortable about publicly admitting their support for him. 4 years later, there's more performance reasons to be unhappy with him. And so I think just there's been a big change in how Republicans might be thinking about his performance or evaluating him. And so if you just have any thoughts on any of those points, I'd love to hear them.
I can't answer the second question so much because we didn't think to ask these questions back in 2016. But as far as the demographics, it is, I think, in people that feel out of step with where they live and who they interact with. So the question about yard signs. If you're 18 to 34 years old and you're a Trump supporter, 88% said they won't put a yard sign in their yard because they're afraid it would be vandalized. And similar to that, people who live in the Connecticut Valley, a Democratic part of the state, 82% say they won't put a sign in their yard. New Hampshire Public Radio listeners, 78%. So getting at your higher income, higher education voters, that I think is where you're seeing it. The highest people who are the least likely to be concerned about that yard sign issue are people who live in the Seacoast and people who are making $100,000 to $150,000 a year. So probably people that are fairly comfortable with the neighborhoods they live in and not so much worried about what's going on. But we see the similar kinds of demographics throughout this, throughout that for Trump supporters. Women are less likely to talk about Trump to their support for Trump to their friends and coworkers. I think that reflects the perception that women are definitely against Donald Trump. People with children in their household are less likely to talk about that as well. So to your point, yes, I think it has to do where you live and who you interact with primarily, which is going to drive your hesitancy about expressing your support publicly for Trump. We just don't see the same big differences among Biden supporters. There's just not that much concern across any demographic groups for Biden support.
That's really interesting. Well, I know there's probably many people with other questions for you, so I'm going to turn the Q&A over to Ben at this point, and he will manage the audience comments. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith and Professor Jarrett. This has been fantastic so far. We have a question from Jason Barabas, also about shy Trump voters, who asks, quote, "Isn't there an opposite effect working against the shy voter theory? So theories related to bandwagon effects, personal influence, or even impersonal influence suggest that people will follow those perceived as winning or leading in the polls. Also, wouldn't shy Trump voters be more likely to exaggerate their support for Trump, trying to persuade others who are on the fence? Why help Biden through answering polls sincerely?"
I don't know. That goes against the bandwagon effect. I think is dissipated in recent years because of that party polarization, where we just don't see Republicans saying, you know what, doesn't look like my guy is going to win, so I'm going to go vote for the Democrat. And you don't see it on the other side as well. I think we see that polarization all the way down the ticket, frankly. And I think the spiral of silence theory is a little bit better explaining the psychological motives. People generally don't change their partisan stripes. like being a Yankee fan or a Red Sox fan. If the Red Sox have a crummy year like they did this year, people don't say, well, guess what? Well, the Yankees are going to the playoffs. I guess I'm going to root for the Yankees now. It just doesn't happen. And I think that in politics, people don't change their stripes and jump on the other party's bandwagon. At worst or at best, depending on your perspective, they stay home. And I think that the 2016 evidence, and that this fits in with the spiral of silence theory that Noella Neumann puts out, which she had decades of data for, fits pretty well. I think it fits more logically with the place that we are right now, especially since we saw the same thing in 2016 or similar thing in 2016.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have a quick question from Lynn Sidlow, who asks if your shy Trump voter stats are national or just for New Hampshire.
These are just from New Hampshire, and we just put these out Monday. They're available on our website, so I encourage you, if you want to go and take a look at this and read the data and look and dig into it a little bit more, if you just Google UNH Survey Center, you can find this pretty easily. But I think that I was just fascinated by how large the difference was between Democrats and Republicans, or Trump voters and Biden voters on this. When my staff and I were talking about putting these onto the poll, frankly, my staff was saying, well, it's not going to be much difference. Why should we expect Biden and Trump voters to be different in how they behave on this? And I said, well, put them in to see, test it out. And boy, did it turn out even larger than I had ever anticipated it would be.
Yeah. Bill Martin asks if there are any insights to be gained from political betting venues. He's heard that they predict outcomes very effectively, but he doesn't know if those are actually good.
There is some evidence that shows they predict outcomes pretty well, but they're largely driven by polls. That's the people that bet on those things largely take into account what the polls are saying is likely to happen and pick the winners that way. You don't see too many people kind of being hedge fund arbitrageurs in here. So it's, I would say that it's like any sort of market like that. You want to buy low and sell high and hedge your bets. There may be some people trying to game the system now if you're seeing some of the markets having Biden up at 80 cents or 85 cents. Might be time to buy Biden or to buy Trump and then sell them a little bit later, because you might make a couple bucks off of it if you want to do the arbitrage.
Right. Well, we have a question from Bob Coates, who asks if the New Hampshire independent voter will have a significant impact on this election. I think New Hampshire voters are notoriously finicky. So could we get your thoughts on that?
Sure, and I know I can't ask this, but I want to ask how many people, if you raise your hand magically to say if you are an independent in New Hampshire, you're registered independent. And I imagine there's a lot of people in the room that are doing that. The truth is there's no such thing as an independent voter in New Hampshire. You can register Republican, Democrat, and undeclared. And we unfortunately call those people who are registered undeclared independents, but they're really not. The great majority of those people who are registered undeclared are either Republicans or Democrats. We consistently see about 35% or so, 35 to 38% are really Democrats. They vote consistently Democrat. They hold ideological positions similar to Democrats. The biggest difference is they're less likely to vote than are registered Democrats. And about 30% are really Republicans. They behave like Republicans, except they don't vote out. They don't vote as often as do registered Republicans. And those people that are truly independent and are registered undeclared, they are least likely to vote, least likely to pay attention to politics, and least concerned about what goes on in elections. So in midterm elections, they're the ones who just don't show up. They might show up in a presidential election, but they just don't show up very often. So we have this myth of the independent voter in New Hampshire, which I think is that it's just a myth. We are really not much different than other states. I use as a comparison Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, you can register Republican, Democrat, or unaffiliated. And about 55% of the voters, registered voters in Massachusetts, are registered unaffiliated. And nobody would mistake Massachusetts for having an independent electorate. It's a consistently Democratic electorate.
All right. Duncan Wood would like you to discuss unhappy Republicans a bit more. I think those are the Republicans who just dislike what the Trump administration has done, and how will those people affect the election in New Hampshire and the general election?
Yeah, that's going to be interesting, and we saw some of this in 2016, where Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, did quite well, better than most people would have expected, in part because there were a lot of Republicans who just didn't like Donald Trump. They couldn't pull the lever for Trump, but they also couldn't pull it for Clinton. Same thing going back to my analogy with Red Sox fans and Yankees fans. Red Sox fans aren't going to go and root for the Yankees, but if somebody else is playing the Yankees, they might root for the Tampa Bay Rays or somebody. They might vote for the third party candidate, but it's going to be very difficult for them to pull the lever for the opposing party. There will be many that do. Certainly, we have to talk in normal distributions here. This time around, I don't think we have anywhere near as much discussion of the third party candidates that are out there. Certainly in 2016, there was Jill Stein for those the Democrats who weren't too fond of Hillary Clinton. But I think that there's going to be some, and that's one of the major reasons that I'd say that Donald Trump isn't doing as well here. If you look at Democrats, more than 90%, I think it's almost all Democrats, self-identified Democrats, say they're going to vote for Joe Biden, but we're only getting around to 85% of Republicans saying they're going to vote for Donald Trump. So that probably is explaining some of that magnitude and difference. Again, the one caveat to that is I don't know how many or what percentage of those Republican voters that are going to show up actually on election day are those shy Trump voters.
Well, all right, thank you. I have a quick question about the New Hampshire primary, which I know you wrote a book about. This year, Pete Buttigieg won in Iowa and performed very well in New Hampshire, but then floundered in the race after that. Joe Biden didn't do well in either Iowa or New Hampshire. And I mean, Michael Bloomberg had a strategy that just involved sidelighting those states completely. And I'm wondering if that, might signal some kind of a shift in the role that Iowa and New Hampshire have in national elections. And I'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it certainly is the first time. It's the first time that a candidate won their party's nomination in the modern primary period, that is since 1972. It's the first time that a candidate has won their nomination without finishing either first or second in Iowa or New Hampshire. Bill Clinton finished, I think, second or third in Iowa, finished second in New Hampshire. He kind of did the worst. Typically, you either have to win in Iowa or New Hampshire. The 2020 Democratic primary is really pretty fascinating because it falls in line with some of the political science theory about the party itself. The Democratic Party has always been a stronger internal party than the Republican Party. And the levers of power within the Democratic Party in 2020 were behind Joe Biden, just as they were behind Hillary Clinton in 2016, which enabled them to essentially beat back that Bernie Sanders challenge in 2016. They beat it back again this time. My sense is that there's probably a lot of horse trading that went on. I've had some discussions with people in campaigns that there was some horse trading going on with some candidates. We noticed that the more liberal candidates stayed in. Elizabeth Warren stayed in through the end of the South Carolina primary before she dropped out, so splitting the Bernie Sanders vote. But both Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar dropped out essentially before South Carolina, which meant that Biden had that mainstream part of the party to himself. And then the Michael Bloomberg strategy, which is a reprise of the very successful Rudy Giuliani's strategy of skipping all of the early races and just going down south and hoping to win there proved as successful as Giuliani's was. The only people that made out on that were the political people that were working on the Bloomberg campaign. So it was free money for a lot of political hacks for not having to deliver on much. But Bloomberg, again, threw his support to Biden as well.
Gotcha. Thank you. There's a lot to consider, and that was really a fascinating primary. So with so many people voting by mail in this election, I think there's been a lot of speculation about, us not having the election results the night of, or even going beyond that. And I'm wondering what you think about that, and if that keeps you up at night.
No, it doesn't keep me up, thankfully. There's plenty of other things in the world to keep me up. Most states, even if they have vote by mail, will be able to count their ballots on election night or the day after. A few states have had court cases that have ruled that ballots have to be accepted for several days after the election. Several of those, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, are battleground states. So if it's really close, we could be waiting to see the outcome of those elections later on. But I think that it should be able to go okay. I'm less concerned about not having a winner on election day, election eve, than other people are. In New Hampshire, I'm not particularly concerned at all. We don't have mail-in voting here. We have absentee voting, which is, I think, quite different. You can pick up your ballot, or you can ask to have it mailed to you by your town clerk. And we've had that for years. It's going to be record absentee ballot this year because of the change in the regulations due to COVID, as there was in the state primary in September. But those ballots can all be processed and ready to go and counted with the actual election day ballots. So I don't think that's going to be a problem in New Hampshire at all, really. We'll know New Hampshire's outcome by whenever Durham comes in. Durham is always the hardest, and a little bit over in Hanover. It's the towns that have a lot of new registrants that have the most difficult time processing all of those, because they have to check to make sure that the people who are voting are qualified to vote within those towns.
Okay, thanks. Susan Schalk is curious about the margin of error in a lot of these polling numbers and wonders if they're particularly important to consider in this election. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can go do a whole nother lecture on election polling. Margin of error, if the biggest problem with surveys to me is not margin of error, it's whether or not it uses a probability sample or a non-probability sample. If you have a non-probability sample, another name for that is a convenience sample. You went and got a bunch of people and asked them some questions. Non-probability samples don't allow you to use the central limit theorem and even calculate margins of sampling error, although many non-probability polls still go ahead and do that. But for a probability-based survey, the margin of sampling error is not an indication of accuracy. To me, if you have two surveys that are well done, margin of sampling error is kind of beside the point. If you have one survey I take that back. Margin of sampling error is very small. So I could increase the size of my sample from 500 to 1,000, and my margin of sampling error goes from like 4.4% to 3.5%. So it's like 1 percentage point error that we're narrowing there. But there are so many other sources of error in polls that are far greater issues. Non-response, which is what we were talking about with the shy voter. That's huge. We have no way of measuring that in advance because we don't know who's not responding to us. But non-response error is a big issue. Wording of questions is a big issue. The order that questions are asked are a big issue. How well you work your sample is a big issue. That is, you call them back multiple times, or you just call them once or twice and then hang up the phone and not bother with them. If they refuse to talk with you, do you go back and call them again? So those are the issues of error that are far more important than margin of sampling error.
Okay. As a final question, you mentioned at the start of the lecture that Americans are more divided along partisan lines than ever. But in the middle of the lecture, you also brought up that still your everyday American is really pretty apolitical. They don't pay attention to things. So how do you reconcile that, I guess?
I'll go back to my analogy of the Red Sox and the Yankees. There are a lot of people that grow up in New England. You think of Connecticut, that's kind of halfway between Red Sox Nation and evil empire. There are a lot of people in Connecticut that are going to root for the Yankees or the Red Sox because their family did, their parents did, maybe somebody gave them a Red Sox or a Yankees hat when they were a kid. But they don't pay attention to to baseball. But when the World Series, when the playoffs come around and it's Red Sox versus Yankees, they know who they're going to root for. Partisanship is very similar. In fact, partisanship is the reason that we can have an apolitical population or a population that doesn't follow politics much. I guess that's probably a better way of stating it, because they don't need to. All they have to know is which candidate is the Democrat and which one's the Republican. If I'm a Democrat and I haven't paid any attention, well, I'll probably vote for the Democratic candidate because it's a heuristic device. It's a shortcut for me not have to pay attention. So we talked about the New Hampshire electorate. Less than 10% of people in New Hampshire can tell you the name or are willing to venture that they can tell you the name of their state representative. They're voting strictly for the D or the R after the name. So all you have to do is know if you're a Democrat or Republican walking into the polling booth, and I don't mean by your registration, but by what party you typically lean to, and that's going to determine for the most part how you vote.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Smith.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for putting up with a lot of pictures, and I hope everybody does get out and vote in 2 weeks.
I want to echo Ben's thanks. Thank you so much. Even as a Vermonter, I found that fascinating. We will all be heading into this election much better informed. So thank you both, Professor Smith and Professor Jarrett. I did want to mention to our audience that next week's event with Jake Tapper has been rescheduled to Thursday, November 12th at 7 o'clock. So instead of a pre-election analysis, we'll be having a post-election analysis. So the next time you can gather with us at the Rockefeller Center will be on election night, Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 o'clock. We'll be hosting CBS national correspondent Chip Reed. So we hope you'll join us for that. Thanks again for sharing your time, sharing your days with us. And thank you very much to Professor Smith and Professor Jarrett. See you all in a couple of weeks.